I was 5 months pregnant when my father gave me $200,000 to prepare for the arrival of his grandson. When my mother-in-law found out, she demanded I give her $120,000, threatening to make my husband divorce me if I refused. I signed the divorce petition on the spot, leaving her entire family pale with shock. There are some things that if you don't experience them firsthand, you'd never believe could happen. I was 5 months along, and my belly was just starting to show enough for people to know I was going to be a mother. Yet at the very moment I should have been receiving the most care and affection, my own in-laws cornered me for money. That afternoon I had just returned from my parents' house. I was still holding a bag with the prenatal vitamins my father had slipped into my purse just before I left, insisting I take them regularly so the baby would grow healthy. As I walked onto the back patio, I already felt a strange tightness in my chest. I don't know if it was the sweltering heat of the day or my mother-in-law's gaze watching me from the living room with a coldness that chilled my blood. I had barely set the bag on a chair when I saw her, Margaret, sitting imposingly in the center of the room. In front of her was a crumpled piece of paper covered in figures. Beside her were my husband Oscar and my brother-in-law Stephen. Both were as motionless as statues. This wasn't the atmosphere of a family waiting for their daughter-in-law to come home. It felt more like a carefully laid trap. As soon as I entered, my mother-in-law didn't waste any time. Seeing me sit down, she pushed the paper toward me and got straight to the point, her tone as indifferent as if she were asking me to pick up a loaf of bread. Your father gave you $200,000 for the baby, right? Give me $120,000 now, and you can keep the rest for the delivery. I was petrified. I heard every word clearly, but my mind went blank. I couldn't understand how she'd found out about something so private between my father and me, but what shocked me more was the sheer audacity with which she spoke of robbing her own daughter-in-law. Before I could say anything, she leaned back on the sofa, a dismissive smile on her face, and continued, "This family is in urgent need of money. If you as a daughter-in-law don't know your place, I'll tell Oscar to leave you right now. A pregnant woman isn't irreplaceable, you know." Hearing that, my hands went cold. The baby I was carrying was her blood, her grandchild. I was the woman carrying her son's child, and yet in her mouth I was an object that could be swapped out, discarded, and replaced at any moment. I turned to look at Oscar. I confess until that moment I still held on to the foolish hope that my husband would say something, a single sentence, a simple, "Mom, you're going too far." It would have been enough for me to cling to the last shred of faith I had left. But no. Oscar avoided my gaze, fixed his eyes on the floor, and said in a voice as bland as water, "Just give it to Mom for now, Sophia. We'll sort it out later. It's better than making a scene now that you're pregnant." Those words were like a fist squeezing my heart. I understood then and there. "What does that have to do with you demanding it from me?" I asked, each word a struggle. Margaret let out a laugh, the laugh of someone holding all the cards, certain the other person won't dare to fight back. "Your father's grandson, or our grandson, he's the blood of this family. And if this family doesn't give its approval, don't think you'll be able to keep that money." Before I could respond, Stephen chimed in with a mocking tone that added fuel to the fire. "You act like you care so much about the kid. If you really cared, you'd keep the peace in the family. Keep arguing, and your son will be born without a father." His words made me clench my fists until my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was calculated cruelty. Using an unborn baby as blackmail to extort money from his mother. I never imagined my in-laws could be so vile. Just as I was trying to stay calm, my mother-in-law reached into her purse and pulled out a pre-prepared divorce petition. She slammed it on the table with a sharp thud, looking at me like I was a cornered animal. "Either you give me the $120,000 and you stay, or you sign this right now. We don't want a woman in this house who has money but doesn't know how to look out for her in-laws." The divorce petition lay in front of me, each line as cold as a knife. It was then I realized this wasn't a sudden outburst of anger. It was a planned extortion conceived from the moment they knew I had that money. I looked at the petition, and then at Oscar, one last time. I waited. I was still waiting, but he only looked up once and uttered the sentence that killed every last hope in my heart. "Don't be stubborn, Sophia. It's your choice, either sign it or transfer the money." In that instant, I knew this marriage was rotten to the core. This wasn't about an abusive mother-in-law or an insolent brother-in-law anymore. This was about the man I called my husband, who had thrown me to the wolves with his own hands. It was strange. Just when I thought I was going to break down in tears, an immense coldness washed over me. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't beg, as they surely expected. I simply pulled up a chair, sat down, and picked up the pen from the table. My mother-in-law was taken aback. She probably thought I was grabbing it to make a threat, or to buy time. But I just bowed my head and signed my name. My stroke was so firm the paper crinkled under the tip of the pen. When I finished, I put the pen down, looked up, and met each of their gazes one by one. Then I said very slowly, "You don't have to force me. I'll divorce him myself." The expressions on my in-laws' faces crumbled. My mother-in-law froze her eyes wide in disbelief. Oscar jumped to his feet, his mouth agape in clear panic. Stephen just stared at me like an idiot, as if he'd just witnessed something that completely contradicted the script in his head. They had only meant to use that petition to scare me, to make me tremble and obediently hand over the money. They never imagined I would actually sign it. I gently caressed my belly, feeling the baby move slightly as if in response. Then I looked directly at my mother-in-law. "But don't celebrate just yet," I said, with a calmness that surprised even me. "The petition you threw on this table to threaten me today will be the beginning of the end for your entire family. I know many will wonder why, if my in-laws were so despicable, I married Oscar and moved into that house in the first place, letting things get to this point. To be honest, if I could go back a few years, even I wouldn't believe that the man I loved would sit idly by while his mother forced his wife to divorce him over money. Because before the wedding, I believed I had found the right man. Back then, Oscar was in my eyes a good man, soft-spoken and calm in his actions. He wasn't one for easy flattery, nor was he flashy, which gave me even more confidence. Once I had a high fever during a torrential downpour. He waited for nearly an hour on my doorstep just to be there when I woke up and give me some hot soup. The image of him huddled under the awning, one shoulder soaked but smiling tenderly, still brings a bitter taste to my mouth when I remember it. It turns out that some people, when they're in love, are much better actors than you can imagine. My family isn't the type to show off, but we're people of principle, and we've never wanted for anything. My father, Anthony, worked hard his whole life. He had his savings, but his way of loving me was discreet, rarely expressed in words. Before I agreed to get married, he sat with me on the porch and gave me some serious advice. When you choose a husband, don't just look at his sweet words. Look at whether when the time comes he defends you or abandons you. At the time, I smiled, thinking my father was worrying too much. I truly believed Oscar was a good person. I even considered myself lucky to have found a quiet man who didn't drink, gamble, or cause trouble. When his family came to ask for my hand, everything gave me even more security. My mother-in-law, Margaret, wore a dark, elegant dress. She spoke in a soft voice and smiled with a kindness that seemed genuine in front of my parents. She took my hand and said, "All I ask is that you be respectful when you join our home. In this family, we don't care about appearances or money, and we never consider a daughter-in-law an outsider." Those words reassured my mother, and my father seemed less worried too. Looking back now, I realize she only told half the truth. It was true she didn't care about appearances, because for her, the daughter-in-law's money had to become her family's money for her to be satisfied. After the wedding, to save up for a down payment on our own place, and because Oscar told me it would only be for a while, I agreed to live with them. My thinking at the time was simple as a daughter-in-law. I would try a little harder, be flexible, patient, and everything would work out. I naively believed that if I lived with decency, worked hard, and was considerate, they would love me. Perhaps many women enter marriage thinking like I did, but life doesn't always give you back what you put in. In the early days, I would wake up before sunrise to make breakfast, wash vegetables, and start the rice cooker. After a full day at work, I'd come home to go grocery shopping, do the laundry, and clean. I didn't do it because anyone forced me to, but because I genuinely wanted to earn the affection of my in-laws. I wanted them to see me as one of them, for my mother-in-law to look at me with approval, for Oscar to see my effort and feel secure in his choice of a wife. But the more time passed, the more I realized they only accepted my service, not me as a person. My mother-in-law had a way of speaking that seemed harmless at first glance, but the more you listened, the more you noticed the barbs. She would look me up and down and let out a bitter laugh. Girls from good families are used to being pampered. Let's see how long she lasts without complaining. Or if I came home a little late from work, she would sigh and drop hints. Having a daughter-in-law who works in an office looks good, but someone has to take care of the house. At first I told myself it was just her way of talking, that I didn't want to think badly of her so soon. But my brother-in-law Stephen was different. His insolence was blatant. He was chronically unemployed, living off his family, but always found something to criticize. If he saw me with a new lipstick, he'd sneer, "This house can't support a princess lifestyle, you know." If I changed into slightly nicer shoes for work, he'd drop a line I'll never forget. "You're a daughter-in-law, not a movie star. No need to get so dressed up." It bothered me immensely, but I endured it. I thought he was just an immature, inconsiderate guy, and that it was better to ignore him to avoid trouble. What disappointed me the most wasn't my mother-in-law or my brother-in-law, but Oscar. After we got married, he changed completely. Not in a cold, immediate way, but in a manner that made me realize over time that he wasn't the man I thought he was. In front of his mother, he became submissive and quiet, doing whatever she said. Every time I told him his mother had spoken ill of me, or that his brother had taken a jab at me, he would just placate me with a couple of phrases to end the conversation. "Come on, honey. You know how Mom is. She's older. Or don't pay any attention to him. He's a kid. He doesn't mean anything by it." I hoped that one day he would take my side, but that day never came. Gradually, I understood that it wasn't that he didn't notice. He knew everything, but he chose silence to keep his life peaceful. There were nights when lying next to him I felt a lump in my throat, but then I would console myself by thinking that perhaps all new daughters-in-law went through a trial period like this. I told myself to hold on a little longer, that things would get better. I naively thought that if we had a child, especially a grandchild for them, the atmosphere in the house would soften, my mother-in-law would be less harsh, and Oscar would mature. But I didn't know that from the very beginning, in my mother-in-law's eyes, I was never a daughter-in-law to be loved. I was just someone who had come into her house to work, to have children, to bear responsibilities. And if on top of that my family could contribute money, then I was worth keeping. Those poisonous seeds were there from the start. It's just that back then, I believed too much in the word family, and wasn't clear-headed enough to see it. By the 5th month of my pregnancy, I started to feel not as strong as before. My back ached constantly and my feet swelled slightly. Many days when I stood up after sitting at my desk, I'd feel dizzy. At one checkup, the doctor seriously warned me that from this stage on, I needed to rest more, avoid bending over, reduce stress, and above all, not subject myself to prolonged emotional tension. I kept the report with his recommendations carefully in my purse, but thinking back, it was like a worthless piece of paper, because in that house, nobody cared what the doctor said, nor did it occur to anyone that the fetus I was carrying needed care. Since my pregnancy became more obvious, my mother-in-law continued to demand that I work from dawn till dusk, as if nothing had changed. In the morning, I had to get up early to prepare meals. At midday, go to work. In the afternoon, come straight back to the kitchen, and at night, do the laundry and clean. One day, while washing some vegetables, I had a sudden dizzy spell. Everything went black, and I had to grip the sink tightly to keep from falling. My mother-in-law, seeing this, just pursed her lips and said scornfully, "You're only a few months along, and you're already acting like you're in labor." In my day, pregnant and all, I was still hauling water and chopping wood. Women these days are so weak. All this pampering has spoiled you. I heard her and felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't weakness. Every body is different. And this womb held her grandchild, not just mine. There were days I came home late from work because of an ultrasound appointment. I'd barely set foot on the patio, not even having had a sip of water, and my mother-in-law would already be yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The daughter-in-law of this house has become a queen since she got pregnant. She brings no money from work, only bills for doctors and medicine. She said it loud enough for people on the street to hear. I stood in the middle of the yard, my ears burning. The pain of her words was sometimes sharper than the backache and exhaustion I endured every day. My brother-in-law Stephen became increasingly insolent. He would sit with his legs crossed on the sofa, scrolling on his phone while dropping comments so inappropriate they left me cold. Once he looked me up and down and laughed. "With that sour face you're carrying around while pregnant, I hope the kid doesn't turn out with the same personality." What a burden. A seemingly casual remark, but enough to wound someone for the entire day. Another day, my father brought me a gourmet gift basket with artisanal cured meats so I could eat well. Before I could even try it, Stephen opened the fridge, took one of the packages, and ate it right there. While chewing, he said, "Good food in this house is for everyone. Why are you hoarding it like it's gold?" I got so angry that when I said something to him, he just shrugged as if I were the stingy one. In moments like these, I looked for a bit of justice from my husband. But Oscar always repeated the same tired line just to end the matter. "Come on, honey. You're pregnant. Don't take things to heart. Or just let it go. They're only words." He didn't do anything. After hearing it so many times, that phrase stopped being a comfort. It became a way to silence me, to force me to swallow all my sorrows so his family could have peace. His mother and brother could say whatever they wanted, but I was only allowed to be quiet. Oscar's supposed harmony consisted of placing the entire burden on his wife. During that time, my father started visiting more often. He wouldn't call ahead. Sometimes he'd show up with a bag of fruit or a special carton of milk for pregnant women, saying he was just passing by. But I knew that wasn't true. He was just worried about me. My father is very observant. He didn't ask much, but just by seeing my face get thinner or the way I'd step aside whenever my mother-in-law spoke, he understood that his daughter's life wasn't easy. Once he sat next to me, took my hand and said in a low voice, "If you're not happy, come home. Dad can take care of you and my grandchild." Hearing him, I felt my eyes well up with tears. That simple sentence made me want to break down. But I always lied to my father, telling him I was fine. I'd assure him with a smile that my mother-in-law was just a bit difficult, that Oscar loved me, and that it would all pass. I didn't want to worry them more or have them think their daughter was living a miserable life after getting married. But deep down, I started to be afraid. Afraid that if I stayed in that house one day, I wouldn't just be exhausted. I'd be pushed to my limit. The baby in my womb should have been treated as a life that needed protection. Yet in that house it seemed more like an excuse to give me orders, to force me to be silent, to block any attempt at resistance on my part. Then something happened that truly put me on high alert. My mother-in-law's tone suddenly changed. She no longer criticized me directly, but started speaking to me with an unnatural sweetness. During dinner she'd suddenly ask, "Has your family sent you anything?" Other times she'd smile and say, "Your father will love his first grandchild so much. I'm sure he'll give him lots of things, won't he?" One day she even sat next to me, and in a tone meant to sound concerned, said, "I can see your family is not just anybody. When the baby is born, I'm sure your parents will take care of everything right." The softer her voice became, the more my blood ran cold, because I knew someone like Margaret doesn't change their character for no reason. One afternoon I was so tired I asked to leave work early to rest. From the slightly ajar window of my room, I heard my mother-in-law's voice in the yard, speaking in a low tone with an acquaintance. She laughed and said, "My daughter-in-law is the type to cling to money, but the day will come when she'll have to let it go." I lay still in bed, rigid. At that moment, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but a bad premonition took hold of me. It was like when the sky is calm, but the wind suddenly changes direction. You know a storm is coming. It was during those 5 months of pregnancy that I finally opened my eyes. My in-laws didn't just despise me. They were secretly plotting something related to money. I didn't know exactly what it was or how much they knew, but I understood that the coming storm wouldn't be limited to a few jabs or minor abuses. And I couldn't imagine that just a few days later the biggest secret between my father and me would come to light, unleashing all the tragedy that followed. I thought I had been careful enough, but sometimes in life a single small oversight is all it takes for a massive storm to crash down on you. It all started one evening, when my father called me to come over for dinner. His voice sounded more serious than usual. He didn't ask what I wanted to eat or how my morning sickness was, as he usually did. He just said, "When you get out of work, come over. I need to talk to you." His tone left me unsettled. I don't know if it was intuition or because I was overly sensitive at the time, but a simple change in a loved one's voice was enough to make my heart sink. That evening, I left work early and went to my parents' house. As I walked in, the familiar smell of roast chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air. My mother was in the kitchen, and my father was sitting at the dining room table. In front of him was a neatly placed manila folder. The way he rested his hand on it and looked at me in silence, I knew this was no trivial matter. Dinner was almost completely silent. My parents didn't ask many questions, just kept putting food on my plate and telling me to eat while it was hot. That very quietness created a lump in my throat. When we finished, my mother discreetly went to the kitchen, and my father pulled up a chair, opened the manila folder, and slowly took out the documents for a savings account and several bank transfer receipts. Before I could understand anything, he pushed the papers toward me. "I've put $200, 0 inches your name. Take this money for the delivery to hire someone to help you during your postpartum period. And if you need it later, buy yourself a small condo in your name so you and the child have a peaceful place to live." I listened to his words and felt my throat close up. I looked at the figures on the papers and then at my father, my eyes filling with tears. For months, I had been enduring, smiling and saying everything was fine so as not to worry them. And yet my father, with his sparing use of words, had seen it all. He didn't ask what abuses I was suffering, nor did he force me to tell him my sorrows. He had simply and silently prepared an escape route for his daughter. A father's love sometimes isn't in words of comfort, but in thinking of a way out for you in case life corners you. "This money is for you, my daughter, to take care of yourself and my grandson. It is not for your in-laws. Remember that well," he warned, looking at me intently. "Keep it a secret. Don't tell anyone over there." I don't know what will happen, but if they find out about the money, there will be trouble. I could only nod repeatedly. At that moment, I felt a mix of love for my father and a self-pity that made me want to cry. It turned out that the ones who understood me best and thought furthest ahead for me were still my own parents. I carefully placed all the documents back in the folder and put it in my purse. As I left, my mother gave me several boxes of pregnancy supplements, and my father from the doorway repeated for me to be careful and protect my belly. I was truly exhausted that day, perhaps from the lack of sleep in previous days and the emotional turmoil. On the way home, I felt a bit dizzy. When I arrived, I only had time to change my clothes and lie down for a while. I didn't realize that, in a moment of carelessness brought on by fatigue, a bank transfer receipt had slipped out of the folder and ended up in the outer pocket of my purse. That small oversight was the spark that ignited everything. That night, while I was in the shower, Stephen was looking for the car keys. He had always been inconsiderate, rummaging through others' things, as if they were his own. When he couldn't find them on the entryway table, he went straight into our room and started going through my purse. I later learned that while searching the outer pocket, he saw the corner of the receipt sticking out. Seeing the figure of $200,000, he froze and pulled it out to get a better look. For someone like Stephen, the sight of money makes his eyes light up. He immediately took a picture of it with his phone and sent it to his mother. Then the two of them sat in the living room whispering to each other as if they had found a treasure. I knew nothing. When I came out of the shower, I only noticed that the atmosphere in the house was strange. My mother-in-law was sitting on the sofa. She glanced at me and quickly looked away. Stephen pretended to be absorbed in his phone, but a malicious smile played on his lips, and Oscar looked at me a little longer than usual and asked normally, "Are you tired?" Precisely because everything seemed so normal, I suspected nothing. I kept thinking it was me, that I was being paranoid because of the pregnancy. But from the next day on, my mother-in-law's attitude changed radically. There were no more direct criticisms. Suddenly, her voice became so syrupy it gave me goosebumps. In the morning, she brought me a glass of warm milk and said, "Here, honey, drink this now that you're going to give me a grandchild. I have to take better care of you." I listened to her words and felt a shiver. This sudden kindness didn't comfort me. It only unsettled me. Because someone like Margaret doesn't change overnight. Not just her. Oscar was acting strangely too. He started asking about my doctor's appointments, and at night he would even suggest ordering a special soup for me to eat well. Sometimes he would stroke my belly and ask with a smile if the baby had been kicking much. If it had been before, maybe I would have been happy. But after so much time of coldness, this sudden kindness didn't feel like concern. It felt more like they were testing the waters to see if their prey had let its guard down. Just 2 days later, I went down to the kitchen for some water. As I approached the back door, I heard my mother-in-law and Stephen talking in low voices. Margaret's voice was deep but sharp, and every word reached my ears with terrifying clarity. If she has 200, she has to cough up 120,000 one way or another. If she doesn't give it up willingly, we'll threaten her with divorce. She's pregnant. She won't dare to lose her husband. Stephen laughed disdainfully. His voice was mocking and cruel. "She's a soft touch, Mom. A little pressure, and she'll cave." I stood behind the door, frozen the glass of water trembling in my hand. So they not only knew, but they already had a plan to get the money from me. What hurt the most wasn't my mother-in-law's greed or my brother-in-law's malice. It was that later that night, as I watched silently from my room, I saw Oscar sitting in the living room listening to his mother without saying a word. He didn't look surprised, which meant he knew. And knowing he had chosen to take their side. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, my hand on my belly, feeling my son's gentle kicks. I suddenly felt that I could no longer afford to be naive. All the details from the previous days clicked into place like a macabre puzzle. The indirect questions about my family. The sudden change in my mother-in-law's attitude. Oscar's feigned kindness. Stephen's furtive glances. It all had an explanation. They had seen the money, and from that moment on, in their eyes, I was no longer their daughter-in-law or their pregnant wife. I was just a walking safe. The next morning, as I was leaving my room, my mother-in-law said, "Tonight, we're all going to sit down and talk. We need to clear things up." At the same time, my phone vibrated. It was a text from Oscar. A single sentence, "Don't make Mom angry. If this gets sorted out peacefully, everyone wins." I stared at the screen for a long time and then turned it off. In that instant, I knew that the real storm was about to break over me. That night, just as my mother-in-law had announced, the whole family was waiting for me in the living room. As I came down the stairs, I saw a pitcher of iced tea, 4 glasses, and a bowl of sunflower seeds on the coffee table. At first glance, it looked like the setting for a family chat, but the air was so thick you could barely breathe. My mother-in-law sat in the center of the sofa, her back straight and her face impassive. Oscar was to her left, and Stephen to her right, arms crossed as if waiting for a show to begin. I had barely sat down when my mother-in-law pushed a glass of tea toward me. Her voice was sweet but sharp. "Drink up. Then we'll talk." I didn't touch it. Since morning my mind had been a whirlwind. Now that glass of tea seemed like the prelude to an interrogation, not a gesture of kindness. And I wasn't wrong. Without beating around the bush, she placed her hands on the table and got straight to the point. "Your father gave you $200, 000. So give us $120, 000. The family urgently needs the money, and a good daughter-in-law should look out for her in-laws first." Even though I had been prepared since I overheard them in the kitchen, my heart sank. I looked at her steadily, trying to remain calm, and asked, "What does the family need money for?" I asked, not because I didn't know what they were aiming at, but because I wanted her to verbalize the reason herself. But Margaret didn't answer directly. She offered a half-smile, glanced at Oscar, and changed the subject. "Those are adult matters. You don't need to know the details. Just understand that the family is in a tough spot, and as a daughter-in-law you can't just stand by." I knew she would never tell me the truth. She would never admit she had secretly mortgaged a piece of family land to finance one of Stephen's failed business ventures, which turned out to be a cover for his losses. She just wanted to use the word family to turn the money my father had given his grandson into a life raft for her own miscalculations and those of her lazy son. Thinking about it, the sadness turned into a cold anger growing inside me. Seeing my silence, my mother-in-law changed her tone. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on my belly, and let out a chilling laugh. "Think it over carefully. You don't want to end up on the street with that belly and divorced. Your family would be the laughingstock of everyone." Her words gave me goosebumps. She wasn't appealing to morality or affection. She was aiming directly at a pregnant woman's greatest fear: abandonment, ridicule, the pitying and contemptuous stares of others. I turned to Oscar. I knew I shouldn't expect anything, but a part of me still wanted to hear something from his mouth, even if it was a phrase less cruel than his mother's. Oscar was silent for a moment, then spoke in a cold, monotonous voice, as if analyzing a math problem. "This family has supported and cared for you. Now that we have problems, you need to contribute. Don't cling to the money as if it's your life." His phrase, "this family has supported you," stunned me and trampled on what little pride I had left. It turned out that all the months I worked contributed to household expenses, got up early to cook, did the laundry, and even while pregnant worked myself to the bone in his eyes. It all boiled down to one word: supported. I turned back to him. I looked him straight in the eye and said very slowly, "My father gave me that money to take care of me and our son, not for your mother to put out the fires she and your brother started." I had barely finished when my mother-in-law slammed her hand on the table. The tea glasses clinked. "Insolent," she screamed. "Who started what? If you're the daughter-in-law of this house, your money is also for this house. Just because your family has a little money, you think you have the right to disrespect your husband and your mother-in-law." Stephen beside her also stood up, his eyes bulging. "Exactly. Don't think you're so important just because you have money. Without this family, where would you give birth? Where would you live?" A bitter laugh escaped me. The same people who hadn't given me a single day of peace were now talking as if they were my greatest benefactors. Then my mother-in-law did something she had surely prepared in advance. She opened her purse, took out a folded divorce petition, and threw it on the table. Her voice sounded as cold as steel. "I don't like to beat around the bush. You have 2 options. Either you transfer the $120, 000 this week, or you sign this. Oscar is young. He won't have a shortage of women to give him another child." I froze for a few seconds. There is perhaps no crueler phrase for a pregnant woman. I was carrying her grandchild in my womb, and yet she could look at my belly and talk about replacing me as if I were an object. I turned to Oscar one last time. "Her or your wife and your child?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper that held a definitive break. Oscar didn't dare to look me in the eye. He looked down, clenched his fists, and finally could only say, "Don't put me in a tough spot, Sophia. Just do it." That was all. No more was needed. His answer was clearer than all the wedding vows. He had chosen long ago. It's just that, until today, I hadn't wanted to accept the truth. I took a deep breath, determined not to give them the chance to keep pressuring me. to keep using my son as a weapon against me. I pulled the divorce petition closer. I read a couple of lines. My hand wasn't trembling as I expected. Perhaps when the pain reaches a certain point, you no longer have the strength to tremble. I picked up the pen and signed my name with determination. When I finished, I folded the paper, placed it on the table, and looking up, I said word for word. From now on, my father's money has even less to do with this house. The three of them were frozen. My mother-in-law stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Oscar jumped to his feet, his voice sounding strange. "Are you crazy? I was just trying to scare you into reconsidering." I looked at him and smiled a smile so cold that even I felt a chill. "But I'm not kidding. This is serious." Stephen was left with his mouth open, pale, realizing that the prey they thought they had cornered had just torn the trap apart with its own hands. I said nothing more. I placed a hand on my belly, stood up slowly, and walked toward my room. Behind me, I heard my mother-in-law telling Oscar in an alarmed voice to stop me. I heard the sound of a chair moving the footsteps of Stephen, furious at the potential loss of the $120. 000. He had already considered his. But at that moment, I no longer wanted to look back. For the first time since I entered that house as a daughter-in-law, I walked with my back straight and my head held high. And in my mind, only one clear idea. If they saw me as a safe with a uterus, I would be the one to slam the door, shut in their faces. The moment I turned to go up to my room, I heard my mother-in-law's alarmed voice behind me, the sound of chairs scraping and rushed footsteps on the tile floor. I had no desire to look back. I just knew I had to get out of that house as quickly as possible. My instinct told me that once they saw I had actually signed the papers, they would drop all pretense of civility. And so they did. The door to my room had barely closed when the storm erupted. I opened the closet and quickly grabbed my documents, my pregnancy records, some maternity clothes, the medicine the doctor had prescribed, and a few essentials. I didn't have the strength to look at that room again, the room I had once tried to make a home. The bed, the dresser, the curtains, everything I had painstakingly built now felt like a mockery. In my head, there was only one thought: I had to leave now, before they thought of something worse. Just as I was pulling my suitcase from under the bed, the door burst open. My mother-in-law stormed in like a fury, her face red and her hair disheveled with rage. She stood in the doorway, grabbed my suitcase, and screamed, "Where do you think you're going with things from this house? The womb you're carrying holds my grandson. You're not leaving here without my permission." Her words took my breath away. In that moment, I saw clearly that in her eyes I was no longer a person with the right to choose. I was just a body that gestated held money and had to remain under her control until she got what she wanted. I gripped the handle of the suitcase tightly and for the first time looked her straight in the eye without flinching. "I've signed the divorce papers. Whether I leave or stay is my right. And as for this baby, from the moment you used him to blackmail me, you lost the right to call him your grandson." As soon as I finished speaking, Margaret's face turned purple. She pointed a finger at me, her lips trembling with rage, unable to form words. In the doorway, I saw Oscar paralyzed. Perhaps at that moment he began to understand that I was no longer the wife who swallowed her tears in silence. But it was Stephen who reacted fastest. He lunged at me and ripped the folder I was clutching to my chest, growling, "Leave everything. A woman like you can only leave this house with the clothes on your back. Don't even dream of taking the money." I felt a surge of anger and fear, especially when he tried to snatch the folder. I held onto it with all my strength. In the middle of the struggle, I lost my balance, and my belly hit the corner of a table hard. A sharp pain shot through my body. I turned pale and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Before I could recover, I heard Oscar shout not to defend me, but with a hypocritical panic, more worried about appearances than my pain. "Stop it. What if something happens to my son?" Hearing that, I laughed bitterly through my tears. I looked up and met his eyes. "Your son. Did you think about him when your mother threw divorce papers in my face and demanded $120? 000? Oscar was speechless, frozen. And I, in the midst of that pain and humiliation, felt a strange clarity. I discreetly took my phone out of my pocket and sent my location to my father. Before I went to work, he always told me that if anything happened, I should send him my location and not try to face it alone. I also turned on the voice recorder. I knew that with people like them, words were just wind. I needed proof, every one of their sentences recorded, so they couldn't deny anything later. Seeing that I was still holding onto the folder and trying to leave with the suitcase, my mother-in-law changed tactics. She ran out to the yard and started screaming at the top of her lungs for the whole neighborhood to hear. "Neighbors, come and see. My daughter-in-law is running off with the family's money. She's pregnant and only cares about money. She signed the divorce papers and is going back to her parents' house with everything she can grab. She was an expert at using public opinion to destroy others." If the neighbors believed I was a greedy woman abandoning her husband, I would have already lost half the battle, no matter what I said later. And as expected, within minutes several people were peeking out their doors. Some asked what was happening. I knew that if I stayed silent, she would continue, and the story would be twisted to her liking. So I took a deep breath, clutched my belly, and walked out into the yard. My voice trembled, but it was loud enough. "Let everyone hear this. It's my mother-in-law who demanded $120,000 from the money my father gave me for my son. If I didn't give it to her, she was forcing me to get a divorce. She's the one who pulled out the divorce papers." People on the street started murmuring. Several gazes turned toward Margaret now with suspicion. She was stunned. She clearly didn't expect me to dare to tell everything in the middle of the yard. Just then a car screeched to a halt at the curb. My father and my cousin Daniel ran in. Seeing me pale with one hand on my belly and the other clutching the folder, my father's eyes darkened. But he didn't scream or insult them as I expected. He simply stood in front of me, shielding me, and looked at my in-laws with a cold, heavy voice. "I've come to pick up my daughter. From now on, if anyone touches a hair on her head again, there will be no more holding back." His words, though not a shout, silenced the yard. Even my mother-in-law took a step back. My father took my arm, and Daniel carried the suitcase to the car. I had barely taken a few steps when the pain in my belly intensified again. At first it was a dull ache, but in the car it turned into light contractions. My father didn't dare take me home anymore and changed course for the hospital. The entire way I hugged my belly with icy hands and a single thought in my head. "My son, please don't scare mommy." At the hospital, after examining me, the doctor said the fetus was out of danger, but I had suffered a severe emotional shock. I needed absolute rest to avoid any impact, and above all, not to experience any more stress. Lying in the bed, listening to the doctor, I felt immense relief, but also total exhaustion. I thought I had just weathered a storm, but I didn't know that was only the beginning. Because that very night, while I was in the hospital, my in-laws launched a much crueler attack to tarnish my reputation and force me to come back on my knees, begging for forgiveness. I was in the hospital until almost nightfall. The doctor insisted I needed to rest, not overthink things, and avoid any agitation. My mother, hearing this, was constantly in and out of the room now, adjusting my pillow, now placing a thin blanket over my belly as if fearing the slightest oversight would cause me more pain. My father, quieter, sat in a chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the door. I thought that after the chaotic scene at their house, they would stay quiet for at least a few days. But I had barely arrived at my parents' house, not even having had time to stretch out, when my phone started ringing non-stop. First missed calls from my husband's relatives, then messages from mutual acquaintances. Even an old coworker I hadn't spoken to in ages sent me a strange question. "What happened that you left your husband and went back to your parents while you're pregnant?" I had a bad feeling and opened my phone. After reading just a few lines, my hands went cold. On social media, there was an anonymous post, but anyone who knew us would know it was about me. It said that a certain daughter-in-law, after her father gave her $200,000, had become arrogant, looked down on her in-laws, and had demanded a divorce while pregnant to run off with the money. It even insinuated something vile, that a woman with a big belly and a dishonest heart who knew if the child she was carrying was even her husband's. I read that and started to tremble, not out of fear of gossip, but because I understood that my in-laws had started attacking my most vulnerable point, my honor, and that of my unborn son. My mother beside me looked at the screen, her lips trembling, tears falling without her realizing. My father said nothing, just asked for the phone. He read every line slowly, his face darkening. His silence at that moment was more terrifying than any shout of anger. And it didn't end there. Shortly after, several of my husband's close relatives started calling. Some hesitatingly told me that my mother-in-law was calling everyone, saying that I looked down on their family, that I complained her son was poor, and that as soon as I got money, I showed my true colors. The cruelest part was the phrase she whispered to each one: "That fetus might not even be my son's. Women with money become very bold." Hearing that, my ears were ringing. I sat on the bed, paralyzed instinctively, hugging my belly. This baby was the life I had carried inside me for 5 months. The child for whom I had spent sleepless nights with nausea, back pain, and fatigue. And they dared to use him as a tool to slander my name. Just then the phone rang again. It was Oscar. Seeing his name on the screen, I felt a wave of nausea and immense coldness. Still I answered, perhaps because deep down I wanted to know what else that man was capable of saying. On the other end, Oscar's voice was soft, almost submissive. "Come home, Sophia. I don't want this to turn into a scandal. Mom's older, she's just angry. Come back and I'll talk to her." If it had been before, maybe my pain would have softened me. But a few seconds later, he showed his true colors. His voice dropped. It was no longer soft but threatening. "The more you push this, the worse it will be for the child when he's born." I didn't say another word. I hung up. I was done with this game of caresses and threats. They always did the same thing. When they needed money, they appealed to family. When they didn't get it, they used the baby to force me to give in. I lay back on the bed, staring out the window with a frozen heart. It was then I understood that they were no longer hiding their true nature. They were willing to trample even the child I carried in my womb to get their way. That night, as my mother brought me a bowl of soup, my phone rang again. It was an unknown number. I was going to ignore it, but for some reason I answered. On the other end, a woman spoke very quickly, as if afraid she wouldn't get another chance. "Is this Oscar's wife? If you want to keep that $200,000, don't believe the story that your in-laws need money. The $120,000 they're asking for isn't to save anyone in the family." Hearing her, I sat up straight, my heart pounding. "Who is this?" I asked. "Explain yourself." But the woman didn't tell me who she was. She just lowered her voice and said a sentence that chilled me to the bone. That $120,000 is to save a condo that's in someone else's name. If you don't believe me, go to the Sunridge Condos Unit 1208 tomorrow and see for yourself. With that, she hung up. The call lasted less than a minute, but when the screen went dark, I was still sitting there paralyzed, as if someone had hit me over the head with a hammer. I told my parents what happened. My mother was speechless, not understanding anything. But my father was silent for a moment, then said firmly, "This doesn't smell right. This isn't just about a greedy mother-in-law. There's something much dirtier behind this." He immediately called my cousin Daniel, who worked in real estate, and asked him to check the information on the condo at the Sunridge complex. The next morning, Daniel arrived very early. Seeing his serious face, I knew the matter was grave. He sat down, took a sip of water, and said slowly, "It's true. There's a condo at the Sunridge that's about to be foreclosed on by the bank. The amount needed to prevent it is almost exactly $120,000. I listened with a dry throat. But what left us all speechless wasn't the figure but the name of the person living in that condo. It wasn't my mother-in-law or Stephen. It was a girl named Audrey. Before I could ask who Audrey was, Daniel took out his phone and showed me a photo the building's doorman had sent him. In the picture, Oscar was entering the building's lobby with a bag of baby supplies in his hand. I stared at the photo with icy hands, my ears ringing, and for a moment my vision blurred. It turned out that behind my back, my husband was not only unfaithful, he had a love nest, and my in-laws were demanding $120,000 of the money my father gave me for his grandson to put out the fire of the condo. Oscar shared with that woman. I sat in silence, an emptiness in my stomach, but in the midst of that coldness, something inside me began to harden. I understood that from that moment on I could no longer afford to be soft. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, I went with my cousin Daniel to the Sunridge condos. I wore a hat, a mask, and a loose coat to be inconspicuous. Daniel told me to wait in the car in the parking garage while he kept watch from the driver's seat. The garage, with its cold white light, smelled of gasoline and damp concrete, which made me nauseous. I sat hugging my belly, my hands getting colder and colder, with a tiny hope that this was all a misunderstanding. But that hope died quickly. A little over half an hour later, Oscar's car pulled into the garage. I would recognize his silhouette even from behind. He parked and took a large bag out of the trunk. It wasn't fully closed, and from the car I could see several boxes of pregnancy supplements, fruit, and some medicine. Seeing it, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. During my 5 months of pregnancy, no matter how tired or sick I was, Oscar had never bought me a single box of vitamins with such care. And yet, for another woman, he lavished these small kindnesses. I sat still, biting my lip until it felt numb. Daniel recorded the scene with his phone, asking me in a low voice to stay calm. I couldn't answer. I felt as if a stone slab was pressing on my chest. Oscar entered the elevator with the confidence of someone who knows the place well. His determined walk gave everything away. Almost an hour later, I saw them leave the front door. Walking beside Oscar was a girl in a loose, cream-colored dress with wavy hair and fair skin. Her belly was slightly swollen. She was a few years younger than me, with a delicate face. But what left me paralyzed wasn't her beauty, but the way Oscar slowed his pace to support her back, bent down to fix her sandal, and even put his hand in front of the car door so she wouldn't hit her head. Those tender gestures, the same ones he used to show me at the beginning of our relationship, had disappeared from me since we got married, and even more so since my pregnancy. I didn't need an introduction or any more proof to know she was Audrey. The scene was like a direct stab to the heart. I felt an icy cold. For a moment I wanted to get out of the car and confront them, but just then my son moved inside me. I stopped pressing my hand on my belly. I was no longer just a betrayed woman. I was the mother of a child. I couldn't act impulsively. Oscar and Audrey didn't go far. They sat at a coffee shop next to the building. From the car we couldn't hear the whole conversation, but Daniel was able to record some fragments with his phone's zoom. At first it was just angry gestures, but then they started to argue. Audrey leaned back in her chair, her hands on her belly and her brow furrowed. Oscar was talking non-stop as if trying to console her. Suddenly she pushed his hand away, her voice loud enough to be heard on the recording. "I already told you, fix it once and for all. If the bank forecloses on the condo, I'm not moving into some rental with you with this belly. Your mother promised to get the money from your wife to cover it." That sentence was like a bucket of ice water. There were no more doubts. His entire family was in on it from the beginning. Margaret not only knew about her son's infidelity, she approved of it and was actively participating in the plan to get money from me to maintain her son's and his mistress's love nest. The level of shamelessness surpassed anything I had imagined. I had to bite my lip until it bled to keep from crying. Daniel discovered something else. While we waited, he consulted his contacts at the bank. Shortly after, he looked at me with a serious face. "Oscar started making payments on this condo but couldn't keep up. Your mother-in-law secretly mortgaged the deed to a piece of family land to continue paying for it." My head was spinning. So the story that the family was in trouble wasn't to save anyone but to rescue Oscar's nest of betrayal. I went back to my parents' house feeling shattered. As I walked in, my mother saw my face and burst into tears. She hugged me, her trembling hands stroking my back. My father didn't ask what I had seen. He just asked Daniel to print everything: the photos of Oscar at the condo, the times the picture of Audrey, the information on the debt. My father sat up very straight, looking at the growing pile of papers, and said a sentence I will never forget. "To win, you have to hit them where it hurts the most. With people like this, shouting isn't enough." Just then my phone lit up. It was a text from Oscar. "A few words, I'll come get you in a few days. You can't stay at your parents' forever. People will talk." I read the message and felt nauseous. The night before, he had been with his mistress in their secret apartment, and now he was sending me a message like a model husband, worried about what people would say. That kind of man wasn't just inconsiderate or cruel. He was a monster with a human face. I didn't reply. I knew any more words would be a waste of time. But the shock of that day wasn't over. That night, while my father was reviewing the papers, the landline rang. It was the bank where my father had deposited the $200,000. An employee my father knew was calling to verify something. A man claiming to be my husband had come in with documents asking about the procedure to withdraw that money, alleging that his wife was on bed rest and had authorized him. Hearing that we were all frozen, my father asked for the details. The employee said they hadn't given him any information because it seemed strange, and they knew my father's prudence. But the mere fact that someone had gone to the bank using my name to test the waters on how to access my money revealed the true face of that family. They weren't just pressuring me to voluntarily give them $120,000. They had a plan B to steal the full $200,000 if I refused. I sat in silence, my hand on my belly. They had never seen me as a wife, a daughter-in-law, or the mother of their grandchild. To them, I was just a safe with a pregnancy. And at that moment, any feeling that might have been left in my heart was extinguished completely. After the call from the bank, I barely slept. Lying on my side, hugging my belly, I stared at the ceiling as the images of the past few days replayed in my head. I thought betrayal was the worst pain, but discovering that the man I shared my life with was trying to access the money my father had set aside for me, and my son was something much worse. It wasn't just pain. It was a deep disgust at the realization that I had been deceived and treated like a mere prize. The next morning, before I could get up, I heard murmurs on the street. My mother looked out the window with a frown. I went out onto the porch and saw him. Standing in front of my parents' house under the pale morning light was Oscar. He was wearing a white shirt, his hair combed, and a haggard expression as if he hadn't slept in days. In his hands was a bag of items for pregnant women: milk, fruit, vitamins. I knew immediately it was another of his performances. Oscar was an expert at creating an image of a victim. He had chosen to plant himself in front of my house first thing in the morning when the most neighbors were passing by so everyone could see the scene of a patient husband waiting for his wife. And as I expected soon, several people stopped to look and whisper. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, Oscar looked up and suddenly knelt in front of the door. The gesture startled my mother, but it only sent a chill down my spine. He raised his face, his voice choked in a masterful performance. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I lost my temper and let things get out of hand. Please come home. I can't live without you or our son." If I hadn't seen him bringing those same things to Audrey's apartment, if I hadn't heard that woman say his mother had promised to use my money to pay his debts, perhaps my heart would have softened. But now this scene disgusted me. My mother, furious, was about to slam the door, but my father came out and stopped her. "Let him," he said in a low voice. "Let's see how far his act goes." Oscar, hearing this, grew bolder. He began to lament, saying he hadn't eaten or slept, that he was caught between his mother and me, that his mother was old and short-tempered but deep down loved us. In a pitiful tone, he added, "I know my mom went too far, but for our son's sake, forgive me this one time. If the family breaks apart, the child will suffer." Some neighbors started to murmur, "Come on, ma'am. If the man has humbled himself like that, forgive him." I didn't blame them. They only saw a man on his knees. They didn't know what was behind it. But my father was different. He walked to the door, looked Oscar straight in the eye, and asked him a single question in a chilling voice. "So what about the condo at the Sunridge and Miss Audrey?" I saw Oscar's face change in an instant. His eyes froze, his lips tightened. But he quickly regained his composure and forced a smile. "Dad, it's a misunderstanding. That condo belongs to a business partner, and Audrey is just an acquaintance. I helped rent it temporarily." His clumsy lie turned my stomach. At this point, he was still treating me like an idiot. I didn't argue. I simply took out my phone and played the recording from the coffee shop. In the morning silence, Audrey's voice rang out clearly. "Your mother promised to get the money from your wife to cover it." Hearing it, Oscar's face went white. His hands, which had been clasped in a gesture of supplication, fell to his sides. He no longer dared to look at anyone. I walked to the door, and in a calm but cutting voice said to him, "Are you kneeling here because you miss your wife and son, or because you still haven't gotten the $120,000? You're a great actor. But a man who embraces his mistress with one hand and begs his wife with the other is too disgusting for me." The neighbors fell silent. No one else asked me to forgive him. Exposed Oscar showed his true face. He jumped to his feet, his eyes bloodshot, and hissed low enough for only us to hear. "Don't push me. If you make a scandal out of this, don't expect me to leave you and your son in peace." I no longer felt fear. With that sentence, he had torn off his last mask. I looked him in the eye and replied without hesitation, "A man who kneels on the street and threatens his wife in private. If I went back to you, I'd be more pathetic than you are." My father stepped between us and pointed to the street. "Get out of my house. Now. Next time you want to talk, let it be with a lawyer." Oscar froze for a moment, then left. But before starting his car, he turned and shot me one last threat, his voice distorted with resentment. "You'll be back on your own. Let's see how long you last, raising a child without a husband to back you up." His words made me tremble with rage, but they also made me understand that he wouldn't give up. After this failure, they would try something even dirtier. And so they did. That same night, the acquaintance from the bank sent my father a scanned copy of a power of attorney to withdraw funds. Seeing a signature that mimicked mine, I felt a shiver. While Oscar was kneeling in front of my house, feigning remorse, he and his mother already had another plan in motion to forge my signature to get their hands on the $200,000. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer just a betrayed woman. I was the target of a calculated plan of theft. Seeing the power of attorney with a signature that nearly matched mine, my hands went cold. It was no longer the pain of betrayal. It was the feeling of someone who finally understands they are the target of a premeditated theft. I sat in silence for a long time, looking at the paper, then looked up at my father. He didn't ask what I wanted to do. He simply pulled up a chair and said in a grave voice, "With greedy people like them to catch them, You have to put the bait right in their mouths. I understood that my father had made a decision. We couldn't let them defame us, threaten us, and also try to steal the money meant for me and my son. That night I wrote a text to my mother-in-law. I typed each word slowly. I've thought about it. If you really need the $120,000 for the family, you and Oscar come tomorrow to a place I'll specify. We'll talk one last time. After sending it, my heart was pounding, but it was no longer the fear of the past few days. It was the determination of someone cornered who refuses to back down. 3 minutes later, my mother-in-law called. I put it on speaker so my father and Daniel could listen. Her voice was syrupy, very different from the sharp tone she'd used when she threw the divorce papers at me. I knew you were a reasonable girl. A woman proves her worth by keeping her family together. Money, after all, is secondary. Listening to her made my stomach turn. The same woman who had accused me of infidelity and cast doubt on my son's paternity was now lecturing me on keeping a family together. I didn't argue. Yes, come tomorrow, I said. But the meeting place wasn't my parents' house. My father had arranged everything, the private office of an acquaintance on the top floor of a small building, a place with cameras, a large screen, bank personnel, the family lawyer, and most importantly, an enclosed space where they couldn't create a scene and divert attention. I wanted every word and every gesture to be recorded. The next morning I went with my father and Daniel. The lawyer was already waiting for us. I wore a light-colored maternity dress and had my hair pulled back. I wanted them to see that I wasn't there to cry or beg, but to put an end to this. 10 minutes later they arrived. My mother-in-law entered first with a forced smile, her eyes scanning the room. Behind her were Oscar and Stephen. Seeing Stephen there confirmed that their greed knew no bounds. They thought they would not only get the $120,000, but perhaps something more. As soon as she sat down, my mother-in-law adopted a pitiful tone. You see, dear, in the end, I'm the one who loves my grandson the most. If I overstepped, it was only to keep the family together. I listened to her false words without flinching. I took out an envelope I had prepared, slid it across the table, and said calmly, "Inside here is the help I'm willing to offer if the family is truly in difficulty." My mother-in-law's eyes lit up. Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. Oscar leaned in and Stephen held his breath. But when she opened it, the smile vanished from her face. Inside there was no check. But the photos of Oscar at Audrey's apartment, the picture of her pregnant by his side, the notice of the nearly $120,000 debt, and finally the copy of the power of attorney, with my forged signature. The three of them were stunned. My mother-in-law held the papers pale. Oscar lunged for them, and Stephen sank into his chair, sweating. I didn't give them time to react. I turned on the large screen in the room. The recordings, dates, and photos appeared one after another. First, my mother-in-law's voice. Either you give me the $120,000 and you stay, or you sign. Then Audrey's voice at the coffee shop. Your mother promised to get the money from your wife to cover it. My mother-in-law was livid. Oscar jumped up to stop the documents, but my father's lawyer intervened in a firm voice. Sit down. Everything you see here has copies. If you try anything, we'll add a charge for threats. The tension was palpable. I looked at Oscar, the man I thought I would spend my life with, and said word for word, you kneel in front of my house, begging for affection while trying to rob me with a forged signature. You demand $120,000 from your wife to support your mistress, and on top of that, you plan to take my father's entire $200,000. How long did you think I was stupid? Oscar opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. Stephen, the same one who had told me I'd leave with nothing but the clothes on my back, was silent as a stone. Just then, the bank acquaintance came in and confirmed that someone had tried to use my marriage certificate and a suspicious signature to request a withdrawal of funds. Although the transaction didn't go through, the mere attempt was enough to make their faces fall. It must be a misunderstanding, my mother-in-law stammered. I looked at her and smiled bitterly. No, this isn't a misunderstanding. It's premeditated theft. I took out the divorce petition I had signed, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Oscar. Now it's your turn. If you sign, we'll settle this in court. If not, I'll present all this evidence in a criminal case and then we'll get divorced. I saw Oscar's hand tremble. My mother-in-law was petrified, and I, for the first time in months, felt like I could breathe. But I knew people like them don't give up easily. They either kneel or bite back with more rage. The moment I finished speaking and pushed the divorce petition toward Oscar, the room seemed to freeze. He stared at me, his hand trembling over the table, still trying to maintain a facade of toughness. He swallowed hard and said in a hoarse voice, "Don't think you've won just because you have this. A pregnant woman, who makes a scene like this, only hurts herself." It was no longer a plea. It was a blatant threat. His last mask had fallen. The man who knelt begging for forgiveness now showed me his true face, that of a cornered coward. My mother-in-law, seeing her son pressured, instantly changed roles. Forgetting her stammering about the forged signature, she clutched her chest and shrieked as if she were the victim. "I raised my son for years, and now over one mistake you're trying to ruin my entire family. Do you have no heart?" I felt an icy cold. She had blackmailed me, thrown divorce papers in my face, slandered my son's honor, and now she was asking me if I had a heart. I wasn't going to let her steer the conversation toward her false morality. I looked at her steadily and said very slowly, "No one is ruining your family. What's ruining it is your greed, your son's betrayal, and the malice of all of you." She froze her eyes wide, unable to respond. Accustomed to trampling on others, she never imagined a daughter-in-law like me would dare to unmask her in front of everyone. My father's lawyer asked Oscar to sign an acknowledgement of receipt for the evidence. But instead of picking up the pen, Oscar jumped to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. He pointed at me, his eyes bloodshot. "Fine. You want a war, then don't complain about the consequences." He grabbed his mother's arm, and together with Stephen they rushed out of the room. I had a bad feeling. The way they left wasn't like losers, but like people retreating to plan a crueler blow, and I wasn't wrong. Less than 3 hours later, I received a call from the hospital where I was getting my prenatal care. A nurse very tactfully asked if I was feeling okay. Someone claiming to be my husband had called insistently asking about my medical history, my state of health, and if I had recently shown any signs of mental instability or paranoia. I hung up with icy hands. I understood their game. Since they couldn't get the money, they would now try to paint me as crazy, a woman who out of jealousy was inventing stories to harm her family. That afternoon, Stephen posted on his social media, "Some people get paranoid during pregnancy and see enemies everywhere. Patience has its limits." The same freeloader was now setting himself up as the judge of my mental health. That evening, one of my mother's neighbors came running to our house. She told us out of breath that 2 strangers had been asking around the neighborhood saying I had left my husband because the baby wasn't his, and that the paternal family was planning a DNA test after the birth. My mother nearly fainted. I sat in silence, not from shock but from disgust. Unable to rob me, they resorted to slandering an unborn baby. My father heard everything and called a friend of his at the courthouse. Then he turned to me, his voice firm as steel. "They've decided to play dirty until the end. From now on, this is no longer a family matter. It's a battle." His words straightened my spine. He was right. If I showed weakness, they would crush me without mercy. That night, while we were all lost in thought, Daniel's phone rang. It was the doorman from the Sunridge condos. He had sent a video from the security cameras. I opened it, and a few seconds later I felt my heart clench. The video didn't just show Oscar. It showed my mother-in-law too. She was carrying a bag of baby gifts and chatting smilingly with Audrey at her apartment door, as if Audrey were her real daughter-in-law. I watched the video over and over, my hands trembling. Margaret didn't just know. She had accepted her son's mistress long ago, and I, his legal pregnant wife, was just a pawn she was keeping on the board to extract money from before discarding me. I turned off the screen. At that moment I remembered that in 2 days it was the anniversary of Oscar's grandfather's death. A date my mother-in-law always celebrated, grandly gathering the entire family to show off her values and decency. Her greatest fear was losing her reputation, and I knew the time had come to unmask her where it would hurt the most in front of her entire family. Seeing the video of my mother-in-law smiling with her son's mistress, my pain transformed into a deep sense of offense. I, pregnant, being extorted and slandered while she doted on another woman as if I didn't exist. Then I remembered in 2 days, it was the anniversary of Oscar's grandfather's passing. For my mother-in-law Margaret, that date was sacred, an opportunity to flaunt her exemplary family to all her relatives. Her greatest treasure was appearances, and her greatest fear was public shame. I knew I had to act there where it would hurt her the most. The morning of the anniversary, I sent her a text. "I'm coming to the house today. There are things we need to clear up in front of the family." Then I silenced my phone. As expected, she called several times. I didn't answer. I knew she was panicking, but there was no room left for compassion. I didn't go alone. My father, my cousin Daniel, and our family lawyer accompanied me. I wore a simple, dark maternity dress. I didn't want to look like a woman coming to make a scene but a mother coming to tell the truth. When we entered her house, the atmosphere was one of a family celebration. The living room was filled with relatives. As soon as they saw me, the murmuring stopped. My mother-in-law, though surprised, forced a smile. "Sophia, what are you doing here? This is a day of remembrance. Whatever it is, we can talk later." I sat in the center of the living room, placed a folder on the coffee table, and said calmly, "That's precisely why I'm here. Because if we leave this for later, the celebration will be ruined even more." An uncle tried to mediate. "Come on, Sophia. You don't air dirty laundry in public." "Uncle, if this were just a marital problem, I wouldn't be here," I replied respectfully. "But when your mother-in-law demands $120,000, threatens you with divorce, implies your son isn't part of their family, and tries to forge your signature to rob you, it stops being a private matter." The silence in the room was absolute. My mother-in-law shot up, screaming, "Liar. When did I ever forge anything I didn't argue?" I connected my laptop to the living room TV. Before everyone's eyes, the photos, recordings, and documents appeared. I started with the video of her bringing gifts to Audrey's apartment. Her voice echoed through the room. "You just don't worry and take care of that pregnancy. I'll handle the other thing." The entire family was petrified. An aunt clutched her chest. An uncle exclaimed, "My God! So Margaret was supporting an affair for her own son." My mother-in-law's reputation shattered in an instant. She stood there, pale, speechless. I continued with the recordings of her blackmail and her slander about my pregnancy. Every word was a slap in the face to the image of the decent matriarch she worked so hard to maintain. The murmuring in the room grew into a clamor of disbelief and contempt. Oscar tried to lunge for the laptop, but Daniel blocked him. My father stood up and warned in a grave voice, "Touch my daughter again, and this will end very badly." The eldest brother of the family, the patriarch, stood up and, slamming his fist on the table, yelled at my mother-in-law. "You have disgraced this family, blackmailing your pregnant daughter-in-law, enabling your son's infidelity. Don't you ever speak of values in this house." Again, Margaret collapsed into a chair, defeated. But just when I thought it was over, a woman appeared in the doorway, breathless and distraught. It was Audrey. She ran in, ignoring me, and confronted my mother-in-law. "You promised you'd help me. Why did you let them evict me from the apartment?" The humiliation for my mother-in-law was total. Her son's mistress was calling her mom in front of the entire family. Oscar tried to pull her away, but she shoved him off. "Shut up. You promised me a house, a wedding. You promised you'd divorce her, and now I've lost everything. I'm pregnant with your child." The confession landed like a bomb. The room erupted. But Audrey, in her desperation, threw a stack of papers onto the table, receipts of bank transfers Oscar had made to her for nearly 2 years. "It's not just now," she screamed. "He's been with me since he married you. Even the first baby I lost was his. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. So the betrayal wasn't recent. From the very beginning, while I thought I had found the perfect man, he was already living a double life. All the initial tenderness, all the sweet words were a sham." My mother-in-law, beside herself, slapped Audrey across the face. "Slut. You come here to destroy my family." Audrey, far from crying, retorted, "Destroy your family. You were the one who got me into this. You told me that if I gave you a grandson, you would accept me above everything else." That was the final blow. All her hypocrisy, her contempt for me, and her obsession with a male heir were exposed. I watched her age 10 years in an instant. Just then, 2 police officers and a bank employee entered the house. Mrs. Margaret and Mr. Oscar, one of the officers, said, "We need to speak with you regarding an alleged crime of document forgery, defamation, and attempted fraud." Oscar froze. My mother-in-law opened her mouth, but no sound came out. And I, sitting with my hand on my belly, felt a strange calm. Facing the consequences was no longer just a matter of family honor. Now it was a matter of law. After that disastrous anniversary, everything fell apart for Oscar's family. The bank foreclosed on Audrey's condo and also on the family land my mother-in-law had put up as collateral. In a few days, they lost both their son's love nest and the family's assets. The police summoned them for questioning several times, and the scandal spread throughout the neighborhood. The family that lived for appearances was now the center of all gossip. The first to fall was Stephen. Accustomed to a life of leisure, he found himself hounded by creditors from the failed business his mother had financed. Oscar also paid the price at work. The rumors of his infidelity and legal troubles made him a pariah. The man who had told me I wouldn't survive without him now didn't even dare to lift his head. Audrey, without the condo and Oscar's support, showed up at their house again and again, demanding money and accountability. Her screams in the middle of the street revealing my mother-in-law's promises were a constant humiliation. But the hardest blow for Margaret was the rejection from her own family. The family patriarch turned his back on them, forbidding anyone from helping them, for a woman who lived by what others thought it was the end. Meanwhile, I took refuge at my parents' house. I focused on taking care of myself, following the doctor's orders, and preparing for my son's arrival. My tranquility was the greatest refutation of all their lies. The people who once criticized me now pitied me. I understood that the truth, though slow, always prevails over slander. One day, Oscar showed up in front of my house again. He wasn't acting anymore. He was gaunt. "Did you really have to take it this far?" he asked in a broken voice. "You were the one who took it this far," I replied. "I made a mistake," he pleaded. "I'll do whatever you want, just drop the charges." I realized he didn't miss me. He missed his old life, his reputation, his comfort. "What I want you can no longer give me," I told him. "I want back the months of my pregnancy. I lived in fear. I want to clear the honor of my son whom you tainted. I want to regain the trust of the woman who once believed in you. Can you give me that back?" He was speechless and left. I felt no joy, only a profound exhaustion. His family was in ruins, and amidst the rubble my mother-in-law had lost what she valued most, her power over others. The day of the delivery came. After hours of labor, I heard my son's cry. It was as if that sound woke me from a long, dark nightmare. I cried with him, not from sadness, but from relief. When the nurse placed him beside me, a tiny, perfect being, I knew I had passed the hardest test of my life. My father, holding him in his arms, had red-rimmed eyes. Finally, he whispered, "Welcome, grandson." I later heard that Audrey had a premature birth and lost the baby. After that, she disappeared. Oscar lived alone in that empty house. His mother fell ill and Stephen had to get a job to pay off his debts. I felt no satisfaction, only a strange sense of emptiness. Karma had come, but the price had been too high for everyone. With the money my father gave me, I bought a small condo near his house, a bright and peaceful place for me and my son. As I settled in, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. The money they had coveted so much finally served its purpose to give me a home. Sometimes holding my son, I look out from the balcony and feel an immense peace. I understood that a woman's strength isn't in enduring but in stopping the self-deception. The day I signed those divorce papers, my in-laws turned pale, thinking they were losing $120,000. But what they really lost was so much more: a daughter-in-law who truly loved them, a grandson they would never know, and the chance to be a family. I don't consider myself brave. I was simply tired of living in a house where love was measured in money and a baby was a bargaining chip. That day, I didn't choose an end, but the beginning of my real life. Some marriages are a prison sentence, and breaking free from them is a blessing. My son didn't lose a father. He was saved from growing up in a home where no humanity was left.